Feed your head, engage your brain, and enter the mind's eye. Your one-stop shop for politics to paranormal and everything in between. I'm your guy, your boy, DJ BJ Turnoff, doling out truth, the sweetest candy of them all. And you're listening to The Mind's Eye on Z Talk Radio. This is the second in a trilogy of Halloween shows for this October 19th edition. For most people, Halloween, it's fun, it's games, we dress up, everybody has a good time. And that's why the last show and the next show have a bit of a lighter tone. Tonight, though, we do veer into the darker side into life's scariest territories, really. True crime, murder, and the justice system. Because for others, Halloween, otherwise known as the Day of the Dead, has a whole different horrific meaning. It can be a constant, painful reminder of a family member, a friend, someone close to you who was taken away in such a horrible manner by being murdered. No one should have to live with this. Even worse, no one should have to live with the killer walking around breathing that same air that their loved one no longer gets to breathe. On this double shot of The Mind's Eye, we're going to look at two cases tonight, one solved, one unsolved, that highlights this terrifying reality. In the first hour, we have award-winning journalist Maureen Boyle. She's going to talk about New England's biggest unsolved crime, the New Bedford Highway Serial Killer. In 1988, Boyle was a police and crime reporter for the New Bedford Standard-Times, and she was the first to break the news that a serial killer was working the New Bedford city. Despite the involvement of investigators at every level, from state and local police to the FBI's top profilers, yet, to this day, the killer still remains unknown. In effort to finally bring justice for the family, Maureen is going to come on the show and talk about her recently released book, Shallow Graves, The Hunt for the New Bedford Highway Serial Killer. We're going to follow that up in the second hour when you hear from best-selling true crime author J.T. Hunter about a more contemporary serial killer case, Death Row Romeo, the true story of Oscar the Butcher Ray Boland, one of the most disgusting and sensationalistic cases you'll ever hear. But first, we try to solve these New Bedford highway killings with Maureen Boyle. Don't move an inch. This is The Mind's Eye on Z Talk Radio. Jack the Ripper. Oh, we're back on The Mind's Eye, by the way. All I have to do is say those three words, and it evokes everything that we're talking about tonight. I mean, his killings over 120 years ago, they remain not to be one of the most gruesome serial killers, but it also remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries. Author Robert Smith claims to have confirmed the authenticity of a diary with the confession of a man claiming to be Jack the Ripper. I wonder if we had the techniques like the FBI had, like in the show Mindhunter, which depicts the FBI's first foray into behavioral science, into understanding the psychology of murderers. Maybe the Jack the Ripper crime would have been solved then. Maybe, just maybe, the Jack the Ripper crime may have been solved by the mother of forensic science if she lived then. And of course, I am talking about none other than Frances Glessner Lee, Grandma Sleuth, a.k.a. the mother of forensics. She also became the first woman in the United States to be appointed a police captain. She might be the most criminally underrated, influential figure in crime scene forensics. As part of her training session, she actually created a series of dioramas based on real-life criminal investigations. And for the first time in over 50 years, they will be put on display in Washington, D.C. You can go find out the location where you can see the dioramas, or find out more about the diary of quote-unquote Jack the Ripper. All you got to do is go to our social media, facebook.com/Mind's Eye Show, and then our Twitter handle @Mind's Eye Show. Just go to our website, themindseyemedia.com. If you go to the website, you can find out more information about our guest tonight, who is coming up next. Investigative reporter Maureen Boyle joins us next to tell the story of a case that has haunted New England for 30 years. This is The Mind's Eye on Z Talk Radio. Helping The Mind's Eye sadly blow the dust off on this 30-year-old cold case is Maureen Boyle, the journalist who originally broke the news of New England's biggest unsolved murder case. Maureen, thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it.
And the scene of the crimes was New Bedford, which obviously, as you know, is made famous by Herman Melville's Moby Dick. One of the metaphors of the book is the captain's obsessive quest to catch this whale. In many ways, the New Bedford Highway Killer is the town's own Moby Dick, and I can't imagine you thought 30 years ago that when you first broke the news, that it would still go unsolved all these years later.
No, I didn't, quite honestly, and that's why it took so long to write the book, because I always harbored that hope and firm belief that the killer would be found. If not within the first year, at least perhaps in the second year or the third year or the fourth year, and even after 5 years. And when that didn't happen, I always kept on thinking, well, perhaps the next year something will come up, someone will come forward, there'll be some new advances in DNA and other types of forensic technology that would help identify the killer. But now that it's coming up on 30 years, it's kind of pretty clear that whoever may hold that key to who the killer is not coming forward. So I'm hoping the book will spur some people to come forward, maybe make them feel guilty about not coming forward so many years back. Sometimes as time goes on, people get older, their lives change, they have families of their own, they do have a sense of, yes, I can't live with this any longer, or, I have the secret that someone told me, and I do have to share it.
And sometimes people don't want to talk to the police even this many years later, so having another avenue, someone who's not, I guess, in that type of community or with a badge, that opens up another way for someone to get out, and maybe hopefully we can solve this case here. So.
Precisely. There's and especially now, there are so many other new ways to communicate. Back in 1988, when this case first occurred, there was no social media, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, there was no email. I mean, there was email, but not commonly used by people, the average person. So there are so many other avenues today that people can get in touch with either the police or other individuals who can forward the information to the proper authority. Right now, I have a Facebook page set up for the book. I'm on Twitter.
Well, why don't you give out that? Why don't you just give out that information right now in case someone's listening and says, you know what, I want to talk right now. So give that out.
My Twitter handle is, and it's one of those things when it's on your computer, you never remember it because it's all there. It's Maureen E. Boyle, Boyle, with a number 1 at the end of it. I have several Facebook pages that are tied to the book. One of them is Shallow Graves, The Hunt for the New Bedford Serial Killer. And there is another one that is just Shallow Graves. Another Facebook page, which is Maureen Boyle, Writer.
And we'll make sure to have those up on our website as well, for anyone who wants to go directly there.
And I answer messages very, very quickly, usually within an hour or so. So I'm very, very responsive to messages.
And touching on the other avenues for people to talk about is, social media has become a great thing. It's and part of that is the reason why serial killers have become almost a part of pop culture mainstay. And I don't really bring that part up for the social commentary aspect, but more to note that these specific murders, the New Bedford Highway murders, it only seems to fade more and more in mainstream memory with each year, objectively, at least from my opinion. Why doesn't this cold serial killer case get the same spotlight or resonate comparatively to someone like Jack the Ripper or Zodiac Killer, especially because it's so contemporary?
Yeah, the Zodiac Killer, it's interesting that you bring that up. The Zodiac Killer was hunting in a large city, Jack the Ripper, of course, there's been so many books written about Jack the Ripper, and with Jack the Ripper, that was an anomaly for that period of time, or so people thought. The New Bedford killer occurred; those killings occurred just prior to the advances in social media. While it was covered quite a bit, and even nationally at the time, both by television and by newspapers, this was before online news. This is before people could, with a click, share a story, share information. So that's one of the reasons I suspect that many people don't know about the case. And there wasn't anything that would really catch other people's attention elsewhere in the country. The killer didn't do anything weird, other than killing people, of course. But there wasn't any unusual signature that was out there for the public to latch onto. And New Bedford is also, in some ways, at that time, a little bit isolated. It was to get to New Bedford. You basically, people going to the Cape would just pass through New Bedford. It was not a destination spot at that time. It was known for, Moby Dick and many historic spots, but it wasn't a tourist attraction.
All right, well, set the scene for us a little bit. Describe life. What was life in 1980s New Bedford, Massachusetts, right before the news broke?
Yeah, New Bedford, 1988. New Bedford was very much a working class community, a waterfront community, best known for its working waterfront. Fishing and the textile industry, main industries for the city. Primarily Portuguese, primarily Catholic. People who lived in New Bedford and the surrounding communities generally came from larger families. People didn't leave the community. They put down roots and stayed. It was not an up-and-coming community at that time. Today it's a very, very different city. But at that time, it was struggling, both economically and trying to improve its profile. In 1988, that was just a few years after the Big Dan's rape case. That case was made famous by the film, fictionalized version of the attack called The Accused, with Jodie Foster. In that case, a woman was raped on a pool table in a bar in the city, a gang rape. That caught the country's attention. Cocaine had just entered the market in the city. Heroin was, in terms of drugs in the city, had really stuck in certain sections of the city. People were coming into the city to buy their heroin because it was very, very cheap. Powers that be, the government officials and commerce officials were really struggling to make the city better. We're trying to make it sort of an artsy, funky community, which I think they've succeeded in doing today. But at that period of time, New Bedford really was in a sea of change. Right before the killings, there had been a series of attacks on female addicts and prostitutes that caught the attention of New Bedford police. The women on the street were talking about some very, very strange men who were trying to kill them or were beating them. The New Bedford police were looking very closely at that. There had been a couple of unsolved murders of women who either were addicts or had just been out for a night on the town and were leaving local bars. There was something going on the street that no one could quite put their finger on.
Was the community terrified, or just...
No. Prior to the killings, the city wasn't terrified. The law enforcement had this inkling that there was something odd going on the streets in certain segments of the community, but it didn't spread to the the community at large. Once the women started going missing, and they're all drug-addicted women, and their bodies started showing up on local highways. All told, there was 11 women that are known to be that were known to have been missing. 9 of their bodies were found along local highways surrounding the city of New Bedford. When this was happening, people in the community, I wouldn't say they were terrified, but they were very, very much afraid and very, very concerned. And they were also wondering who this person was. The more that people asked about it and wondered, the more they wondered, could this be someone that they knew? Could this be someone who went to church with them? Could this be their neighbor? Could this be an ex-husband? Could this be, their relative's ex-husband? Because police investigators were discovering that the men that were using the services of the street prostitutes came from all walks of life in the general area. We were talking doctors, lawyers, ex-police officers, government officials, you name it, they went to the girls. And these were not high-priced, hookers. These were women who had a severe heroin addiction and were only on the streets to get money to feed their habit.
And often the victims get pushed to the background with the serial killer cases, and the serial killer, really the suspect or whoever it is, comes to the foreground. And out of respect, I want to just talk a little about the women. So these women, the victims, they were taken from their families way too early, and like you said, 9 confirmed, 2 others suspected. Paint us a little bit story about the women and their lives.
Well, what's interesting in this case is that most of the women, not all of them, but most of the women were reported missing pretty quickly by their families. And that speaks quite a bit to the culture in New Bedford, where families are very, very close. Families have a tendency to be very large because they're Catholic families, very large and close-knit. As a result, everyone knows everyone. So there was not much criticism about the women themselves at the time because people knew them. All but one of the women were mothers. The first victim who went missing had 2 children. Most of them had 1 to 2 children. A few of them were new to drug use and fell into the addiction life very, very quickly. Some of the other women had struggled for years. One of the women had been in a state prison in Rhode Island and had walked away from a work release program when she was denied parole. She walked away, and she was believed that she wound up in New Bedford and then was never seen again. Another woman was walking up a street in the south end of the city and vanished. Another woman was walking to a christening party that was being hosted by her family. And while her family knew that she had a really severe drug addiction problem, they still kept in touch with her. All of the women really did stay fairly close to their families.
And the women, they left behind, I believe, about 15 children, obviously.
Yes.
numerous relatives. And in your research with the book and in the investigation, did you get a chance to speak to any of the children? And if so, how
yes.
How did they adjust?
Over the years, I've known many of these families for decades, and I got very, very close to 2 of the families. The children that are featured in the book were fine with the book being done. They're very, very cooperative. There's the daughter of Deborah Greenlaw DeMello. That was a woman who walked away from a work release program. Her daughter today has a very, very good job, married, lives in the suburb, has 2 children. But there is still that hole in her life of wondering if her mother hadn't been murdered, how would her life be different? Another woman, Nancy Piva, she had two teenage children at the time. They really felt the loss dramatically because they were living with their mother. They were split up. It was very, very tough for them. But today, both of them are very, very successful and doing very well. Most of the children really have succeeded. There's a couple of them that had some other, personal issues, but that's expected. There's another woman, Marilyn Cardezza Roberts, who is still has not been found. Her remains have not been found. Her parents are still living in the city. They're now in their 80s, and unfortunately, they have no place to grieve for their daughter because their daughter has never been found. They can't have a funeral. They can't go to her gravesite because there is none, because they don't know where she is.
Yeah, and there is no closure in this case, and that's the biggest thing, I imagine, hanging over the family's heads. And when you're doing research for for interviews, you go down some various paths, and I happened to find a forum. Someone brought up, hey, does anyone remember the New Bedford Highway Killer? And it's a testament to how contemporary and how important it is to solve this case, because there were people replying and they were saying, no, that was my aunt, that was my mother. They were clearly relatives and they were talking about it. And that's why I think this case is so important, because you can really feel the pain of these families with that lack of closure.
And part of that is because the families are so large, so that people do not forget. I think everyone has been touched in some way or the other by this case. And it cannot be forgotten. It cannot be forgotten. No one should get away with murder. And whether it's a year, 2 years, 30 years later, person must be identified. The families deserve that. The community deserves that. Anyone who had been suspected of the killings deserves that.
Justice needs to be served for not just the family, but for everybody. And unfortunately, to get to that justice, this is a part that we can't really avoid in the interview. We need to talk about the serial killer, possible suspects, the whole 9 yards. So let's start with the MO. What type of serial killer was he?
It appears at this point he was a fairly organized killer. And obviously we don't know. It's one of those things you don't know until the person's been identified in terms of, okay, what was the motivation or anything like that. But it does appear that he was organized. It is not clear if he knew all of the victims. I suspect that he did, just because of the tightness of the community. At least 2 of the victims were strangled. The other victims, the bodies were so decomposed they could not make an official determination of cause of death. But they were all believed most likely were strangled. Some were clothed, some were not. I know that they have examined fibers and other evidence from the scene. However, in 1988, we have to remember that was not the quote-unquote CSI forensic type of world. DNA was still in its infancy in terms of the courts and in field forensic science. They needed large samples. Touch DNA really was unheard of at the time. There were very few surveillance cameras out there. It was a completely different world back in 1988 when it came to gathering evidence in forensics. Even identifying the victims was a very, very laborious process. What we have today, where fingerprints can be, a person can be identified through their fingerprint almost instantaneously. At that time, some departments were not on a computer system where they could examine fingerprints, where they could identify individuals. Some departments weren't even fingerprinting people for certain types of crimes. So, and in some cases, they had to manually compare fingerprints. So in other words, you had to know who the person was. to determine if it is that person.
Has modern forensic science been applied to this case at all?
Yes.
I mean, is there any? What came up there?
Well, because it's an open case, investigators here, the district attorney's office is very, very careful in terms of discussing exactly what type of evidence they have or don't have in terms of comparison. But I do know that they had used the services of the FBI on repeated occasions. They also had sent stuff to the state police lab in Massachusetts, and the findings of that are still part of the ongoing investigation. They are not saying that it has included anyone or excluded anyone or what path the findings are taking them. But clearly it hasn't led to an arrest yet.
Does that raise your hopes that that this is going to be solved, or really you're not really holding your breath on this one?
Well, I always hope that, because you can't give up hope. And technology has been continually changing over the years, so you just never know. There may be something that they have that they don't even know that they have that can be tested, or that can be tested in maybe 5 years from now or 5 months from now. And things have improved, and there's been so many advances in forensic technology over the years that things that we never even thought were possible.
How were the cops, the investigators able to link all these women to one killer if some of the bodies were so badly decomposed that they couldn't even conclude the reason for death?
It was how they were found. They were all found in the tree line off of the highways surrounding New Bedford. The way the bodies were found, they appeared to be dumped there in a similar manner. It just from the evidence at the scene, it appeared that they were all linked.
And the
background of the women.
And you think the serial killer chose them because they were all prostitutes and addicted to drugs, making them a little bit more easier or susceptible?
It could be one of two things. Either that he picked them up because they were easy targets, or he knew them and picked them up because they were also easy targets. But obviously it was that they were easy targets.
The killer left few clues, really no eyewitnesses turned up anything credible that we're aware of. I mean, do you think the killer was smart, or does help by the timing, like you were saying, lacking?
Yeah, I think it was helped by the timing. I don't think that the killer was, outrageously, brilliant or anything like that. Not in the least. I think it was just sheer luck on his part that he wasn't caught. And because the women were found months, even in one case a year after they were reported missing, it was very, very difficult to backtrack their steps. In some cases, a couple of the women were never even reported missing, so that complicated things even further. The scope of the case really didn't become clear until about August and September of 1988, and by that time the killer was winding down. He had stopped. It appears he has stopped.
Clearly was very successful. Why would they stop?
Well, it could be one of two things. Suddenly the case, there's publicity about the case right around that time, so it started making headlines in the local press. Or the individual just moved on. Or the person's in prison, or the person died.
Well, that's a absolutely terrifying thought if the serial killer is still active and just moved on. And in fact, we're going to touch on that in a little bit. And you talked to a lot of the state and the local police departments involved in the investigative efforts. Yeah, from the outside, it seemed like they took a really long time to put all this together. I mean, do you think that the investigation was boggled or obscured by any external events at all?
I think, given what they had at the time, the investigators didn't know what they had. when the first bodies were found, they were found in communities outside of the city of New Bedford. So New Bedford police didn't have jurisdiction. They had no reason to believe these were individuals that were from their city or reported missing in their city. Also, in the first two bodies when they were found, this was like one of the hottest summers ever in 1988. The bodies were so decomposed, the state police investigators who were handling the case were told that the individuals were likely out there in the elements prior to the winter. So they had no idea at that point that these were, for lack of a better word, recent kills. One of the victims who was found, she was found the end of July. She went missing the beginning of July. But it was so hot, her body was that decomposed in the elements that they thought she'd been out there much, much longer. The same with the first victim. And as a result, I think they were looking in the wrong place for the names of the victims, to identify them. They weren't looking at individuals who were just recently reported missing. And not all of the names were entered into the statewide missing persons report either. Different time, different technologies. I don't think that would have happened today. I think the individuals would have been identified, if not instantaneously, they would have been identified much quicker.
And I think it's hard for people like me to have that adjustment in mind. With my perspective, it's always coming from today, and it's hard to take it and say, no, 30 years ago, literally, like you said, is a different world. But
because think of it this way: they were very, very lucky. With one of the victims, her hand was preserved just by sheer luck. Not the first; it was the fourth victim. So they were able to get a very, very clear fingerprint. And at that period of time, they were just starting to have a fingerprint database in the state and in the region. Now, not all prints were in there. So they ran the print in through the system, and by sheer luck, that print matched one in one of the few communities that was entering prints into the system on this new trial basis. And that the print was entered from Worcester PD. And Worcester, if they get a hit there, the name was false. It came to a woman in Rhode Island. But they have a photo of that woman, and the local police recognized the photo as someone who was reported in Bedford. So it was that convoluted to get a simple ID. And that one was done fairly quickly, within days.
And to get a break in the case, then you'd really have to be more lucky than good, as they say.
Yes. Yes, because the police at the time did look at such a wide range of people and interviewed hundreds and hundreds of individuals. But, people's memories are, even if you're not in the drug culture, people cannot remember where they were 6 months prior, unless there's a reason for you to remember.
That's why they say, memory isn't really reliable when it comes to court cases a lot of the times. And my father is a retired police officer in New York City, so I'm fairly intimately aware. Even today, it's hard to break open cases with the technology I have. So, that's why I think we have to remind ourselves constantly in cases, particularly in a case like this. So, all right. So, who is the New Bedford serial killer, or even killers? We're going to go down the list of suspects, old and new, when the mind's eye returns. This is Z Talk Radio. We're back on the mind's eye with Maureen Boyle, talking about her investigation from the newly published book, Shallow Graves, The Hunt for the New Bedford Highway Serial Killer. Let's try and solve this case, Maureen, here, best as possible. So there were multiple suspects within the town of New Bedford who seem pretty good circumstantial evidence connecting them to it. I mean, is there something in the water of New Bedford? I mean, there was a lot of shady characters around that time, or was that just really what it was like, really everywhere?
Well, I think it's not unique to New Bedford. It really isn't. It's just that New Bedford is much more honest about what goes on in the community. There's shady characters everywhere, and you know what? Sometimes the killers are not the shady characters.
Sure.
In this case, it was several suspects that were examined. Initially, close to more than a dozen. Some of the ones that became public was an attorney by the name of Kenneth Pond, who had developed a cocaine addiction. He had been a recovering heroin addict when he was much younger. Beat his habit, went to college, became an attorney. From the outside looking in, he had turned his life around and was successful. But then he became addicted to cocaine, and while he was still practicing law, his addiction was getting worse. He was so afraid of being found out, he would have some of the girls on the street go and buy drugs for him and bring them to his house, because he didn't want anyone to know that he had a cocaine addiction. Another young man by the name of Anthony DeGrazia, he had, from the outside looking in, he was an abused child. At least that's what was alleged in court. And he had wound up being arrested for attacking several prostitutes. He would pick them up and go right for their throats. He wound up being charged with several counts of rape. All of the girls told very, very similar stories. There was another person by the name of Neil Anderson. He was a very early suspect after several women said that they were picked up and sexually assaulted. And then there were some other people that were looked at, and their names were never made public. But those were the three main suspects. Neil Anderson sort of fell off the grid, if you will, in terms of being a suspect. And it appeared at one point the investigation was focusing both on Anthony DeGrazia and Kenneth Pond. As time went on, the district attorney launched a special grand jury to look at the case, and eventually Kenneth Pond, the attorney, was indicted for one count of murder in the highway killing case. During this period of time, however, the district attorney lost his re-election bid. The new district attorney looked at the case again, brought in a special prosecutor, and the special prosecutor found that there was no evidence to bring the case to trial. There was a lot of innuendo, but there was no physical evidence tying Kenneth Pond to the murder, to that one single murder. And the case was null pros. That means it was dropped. When a case is null pros, that means that if they had more evidence, they could always bring it back again, but there was no evidence at all. That is what the investigators to this day have told me, that there was nothing that tied him to the case. And Anthony DeGrazia
was staying with
never charged in the murder.
Well, staying with Kenneth Pond for a second, is that who you were like you said, you talked to many investigators for the book? Is that they didn't have a hard evidence to do anything with him, but that doesn't mean that they still don't believe he was the one who responsible? Do they believe he was the one responsible?
Well, some investigators do. Many investigators don't. That's the unique thing about this case. There were so many people working on the case, and a case could be built against any individual, but a case could not be tried against any individual.
What prompted them to launch a single-day investigation into, I guess, a former place that he lived? I think it was around 2007.
Long been rumors that there was a body buried on underneath a deck a cement slab deck that he put in. And when the house was taken over by the bank in a foreclosure for a completely different years and years later, the DA's office was able to bring in some equipment and finally put that to rest, and there was no body under that.
Before you mentioned another suspect, Anthony DeGrazia. You mentioned that he was, arrested for violent rapes of several prostitutes around the time of the killings. And he denied killing anyone, but he never showed up for, I believe, a scheduled polygraph. And of course, then he killed himself later. So what's going on?
His attorney said no. And first of all, a polygraph is not allowed as evidence in the courts here in Massachusetts. His attorney at the time, who is a very well-known local defense attorney who used to be the former mayor, he would never allow his client to have a polygraph. I think his attorney wasn't all that thrilled that his client had spoken to the police. His attorney, once he secured counsel, his counsel, as any defense attorney would say, no, you're not doing a polygraph.
Your approach as a reporter, as a journalist, never assume anything, verify everything.
Yeah.
But in a case like this, there are no definitive conclusions. I mean, really all one can come up with is theories for the most part. Following the minimum clues left behind, in your opinion, Maureen, who do you think is the strongest candidate to be the new Bedford Highway serial killer?
I don't know. I'll be honest with you. During the course of by looking at the case again, and when I was doing the original reporting back in the 80s and the 90s, back in the 80s and 90s, depending on the way the investigation seemed to be going, I'd say, yes, they're close. Oh, that's who the killer is. And if anything, it just serves as a reminder that you just don't know that there's a lot of weird people out there and anyone could be the killer. What I do know is that much more work went into this case than I had originally thought, and many suspects were looked at. A lot of psychics contacted the police. They followed up on some of them. Some of the psychic reports were kind of far-fetched. I don't know. I have some suspicions, but I don't think it's fair to say I think it's this person or that person if they haven't been convicted and they haven't gone to trial. It's so easy to say and speculate, this is a person who likely did it, but is it fair? And the one thing that, you learn as a journalist is never assume anything, because when you do that, you wind up putting on blinders and you don't notice things that are going on in the shadows or in the corners. You have to be open to anything.
Is it even possible that it's not one killer, multiple killers, or even that?
It could be.
A lot of times with these, we're told that it's going to be someone who's very close to the victims, and I know one of the victims, Nancy Paiva, I think, or Pena.
Paiva,
thank you. Yes. She had an abusive boyfriend who reported her missing. He was connected with the disappearance of another woman. I believe his name was Frankie Pena.
Okay, yes. Okay. Much was made at the time, and much is made even today about, so-and-so knows this person, that person, and this individual. New Bedford is a fairly small city. Drug addicts know other drug addicts, just as lawyers know other lawyers, doctors know other doctors, reporters know other reporters. In the drug culture, on the street, particularly on the street drug culture, people hang out together. So Nancy's boyfriend, who at the time freely admitted that he had a drug problem, so it's not that unusual for, as I said, for drug addicts to know other drug addicts. But that doesn't mean just because someone knows someone that they're tied to the killing. Nancy's boyfriend at one point was looked at as a suspect, but he was in jail during some of the disappearances, so he was ruled out. I don't think he was tied to the killings at all.
Has there been any new suspects in the last 10 years or so?
I know that the investigators have looked at other individuals throughout the country who have either attacked prostitutes or killed drug addicts or were involved in similar cases, but that still is nothing definitive. They're not any closer today than they were then.
Have you uncovered anything? Is there maybe a dark horse suspect or suspects that you think could be the killer?
There's a couple of them out there. Nothing definitive at this point.
A lot of times, serial killers are said to move around, and New Bedford has a large Portuguese population. Some of the victims, I believe, were of Portuguese heritage, and then Portuguese detectives came here to look into the investigation into I guess they had a string of murders of the Lisbon serial killer. I mean, what are your thoughts that there was some possible connection between the Lisbon murders and the New Bedford Highway murders?
Yeah, I believe that they ruled that out.
What about the Route 8 murders, just a couple hundred miles, less than 200 miles down the road around the same time in Connecticut? There were a bunch of murders of any connections there?
They did look at those also, and they have not been able to rule in or rule out that. But that was fairly close, and it's very easy to get to the Waterbury, Route 8 area from New Bedford, because New Bedford is right on the highway, Route 195, which goes right into 95 and heading into the New York area. But that has not been ruled in or ruled out. They did also look at serial killing case in New York at the time, but he was not in the New Bedford area. They were pretty stymied at the time.
So there's no way I can get you to tell me who the killer is what you're telling me?
No, because I don't know. I don't know.
Well,
if I knew who the killer was, it would be in the book. If I knew who the killer was, he'd be locked up. I can honestly say that the investigators different investigators have their own suspicions, but there is nothing definitive identifying a particular individual as the killer.
Let's hope this interview opens that up and we can get something going. And like you said, hopefully this sparks someone's memory. Where would you recommend someone going if they message you, if they don't feel like going to police? What avenue would you recommend then?
Yep. They can reach me via Facebook. That would be Maureen Boyle, at Maureen Boyle Writer. That's my author Facebook page. Or through the book page, you can message me through there, which is Shallow Graves Hunt for New Bedford Highway Killer.
And I know you have a few upcoming speaking engagements. So if someone's in the Massachusetts area, they can catch you there, right?
Yes, they can. They can. Let me give you my list here. We've got quite a growing list.
It really is, and it's a testament to the work that you've done. So.
Oh, thank you so much. That is very kind of you to say that. What we've got coming up here is books on the Square in Providence on the 26th at 7. The Burlington Barnes & Noble on the 28th, and the list of other appearances are continually updated both on the my Amazon authors page and on the Facebook pages.
And going to one of the events, for someone who may want to come forward but doesn't want to write something online or go to the concert, that would be a perfect opportunity to talk to you in person.
It definitely would. And they can get the book also on Amazon, at Barnes & Noble, or any of their local bookstores.
And it's unbelievable to think that this is your first book, Maureen. Again, it's called Shallow Graves: The Hunt for the New Bedford Highway Serial Killer. This is 30 years in the making, and in some ways, you're telling about a large part of your life. So I hope that this really isn't the last. And are you circling around for a topic on another book, a follow-up of sorts?
Yes, I am. And I'm looking at a couple of different subjects, and I haven't decided which one to pick.
Well, you know the show to come on whenever that book does come out and you want to talk about it. So,
okay.
Maureen.
And if anyone wants to reach me through Twitter, Maureen Boyle 1 on Twitter.
Wonderful.
I'm very active on Twitter.
Excellent. Well, we'll be talking, exchanging some communications on there very shortly as well.
Okay.
Maureen, you're the first one to break the case. I hope you're the first one to break the news of solving the case. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Stay right there. Best-selling true crime writer J.T. Hunter is going to talk about the true story of serial killer Oscar Ray Bolen. We'll be right back on The Mind's Eye.